Good day. This is just, again, before we get on with the video, a reminder that we are now both on the Rumble homepage and, of course, the Locals homepage. You can find my channel, Alexander Mercouris, by typing those words into Rumble, and that will take you to my channel there, so you can watch me on Rumble if you wish. And if you watch any of our channels, the Duran, Alexander Mercouris, or Alex Christoforou on Rumble, if you go to the top, you will find a red maroon button you can press, which will take you directly to Locals. And Locals is, of course, where we have our thriving community, where we publish exclusive content, and where I do live streams every Wednesday. So, with that, let's proceed directly to our video, which is about the comic relief. Comic relief provided courtesy of British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss on a visit to Moscow during a time of deep international crisis and gathering tension. We've just had President Biden of the United States talking about his fears of World War III if US and Russian troops were to fight each other in Ukraine. He's talked again in the most alarmist terms about the possibility of conflict in Ukraine. He's advising all Americans to leave Ukraine, something which I suspect will be extremely poorly received in Ukraine itself. And we see at the same time frenetic international diplomacy. We see the French President Emmanuel Macron going to Moscow. I did a long program discussing the very interesting talking points that he had with Putin whilst he was there. We have Chancellor Scholz of Germany flying to Moscow next week. We've had another meeting of the Normandy 4 political advisors in Berlin, which achieved nothing apparently. Well, I'm not sure whether that's actually correct, but the talks apparently lasted 9 hours, and over the course of them, Ukraine again resisted attempts by the Russians, at least, perhaps now quietly supported by the French, to get them to comply with the terms of the Minsk agreement, the agreement which they signed back in February 2015. And of course, at the same time, there's military exercises going on in Belarus between the Russian and Belarusian armies, exercises which the Russians say are not going to result in any particular outcomes, and in which the troops will return to the barracks after they end. We see Russian naval exercises all over the world, but also specifically in the Black Sea. We have the Turkish foreign minister saying that the Western powers are stirring up panic about Ukraine and should cease to do so. And we've had a decision by NATO to send more dribs and drabs of troops to Eastern Europe, where they will stand around doing very little except annoying and upsetting some of the locals. There are reports that some of the countries to which the troops are due to be sent were unhappy about this and resisted hosting them at the latest NATO meeting. And besides, the numbers of troops that NATO is deploying is insignificant by comparison with the vast forces NATO alleges that the Russians are gathering. So in the middle of all of this, into Moscow flies Liz Truss with Ben Wallace, the British Defence Secretary. Now, Ben Wallace is due to meet the Russian Defence Minister, Sergei Shoigu, today, but Liz Truss met the exceptionally experienced Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. He's been Foreign Minister of Russia since 2004. He is a massively experienced diplomat with a continuous career in Russia's and before that the Soviet Union's foreign service, extending back to the early 2000s. He is one of the most gifted, experienced and hard-working diplomats in the world. And up against him came Liz Truss. Now, there are already odd things about this visit, even before Liz Truss set foot in the foreign ministry in Moscow and had discussions with Sergei Lavrov. First of all, she seems to have spent much of the day, the previous day, the day which she arrived in Moscow on, touring Moscow. She placed a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier, which is a proper and correct thing for her to do. She also dressed in furs, which I presume was intended to remind British and perhaps even Russian viewers of Margaret Thatcher, who of course attended the funerals of the various Soviet leaders, Brezhnev, Andropov and Chernenko, and did make an impression with the Soviet people as a result of the fact that she was dressed in furs. However, those days when Margaret Thatcher visited Moscow were Soviet times, when dressing in fur was perhaps more common amongst Russians than it is today. And anybody who goes to Russia knows that the Russians only put fur on when the weather is exceptionally cold, which it was not in Moscow on the day when Liz Truss was walking around being photographed in the capital. And of course, she was also photographed with St. Basil's behind her, all giving the impression that much of this touring around Moscow was intended as some kind of photo op, maybe a photo op intended, as I said, to remind the British public of Margaret Thatcher. Well, all I will say about that is that I think that irritated the Russians. It suggested a frivolous approach to this trip to Moscow and to the meetings with the senior officials, Lavrov and his foreign policy team, that Liz Truss was due to have. And I'm afraid when the meeting actually did take place between Liz Truss and Lavrov, the meeting went extremely badly. And we know that is the case because, of course, there was a very tetchy and rather icy press conference. I should say the tetchiness was not on Lavrov's side, it was on Liz Truss's side, but Lavrov spared no time in making it clear that the talks between the Russians and the British had hit a complete dead end, and that he found the British position inconsistent, illogical, and even incomprehensible. And we have now received reports, which are all over the Russian media, that over the course of the discussion, the actual private discussion between Lavrov and Truss, Liz Truss was asked rhetorically by Lavrov whether she acknowledged the fact that Rostov and Voronezh regions are part of Russia. These are, of course, the regions where many of these troops are concentrated. And Liz Truss shot back and said that Britain would never acknowledge these territories as part of Russia. And apparently the British ambassador to Moscow at that point had to step in and explain to Liz Truss that Voronezh and Rostov, both important cities, by the way, well-known cities in Russia, are indeed a part of Russia, that Britain, of course, recognizes the fact, and that Russian sovereignty over Rostov and Voronezh is not disputed by anyone, including by Britain. Well, there's been some suggestions that this is a trick question on Lavrov's part. For the record, I don't think so. I don't think Lavrov engages in those sort of tricks in negotiations. I think it was a rhetorical question. The British were constantly harping on throughout the meeting about the presence of Russian troops on Russian territory. So I think perhaps in some exasperation, Lavrov put the question, the rhetorical question, about whether Britain recognizes Russia's sovereignty over Voronezh and Rostov regions in order to drive home the point to Liv Truss that these troops are actually present in Russia itself. However, he must have been astonished. I suspect he was utterly flabbergasted when he got the response from Liz Truss about the British never acknowledging these regions as part of Russia. And as we saw, the British foreign ambassador had to step in to prevent Liz Truss making an even greater fool of herself. Well, this episode demonstrates a number of things. First of all, obviously, it demonstrates Liz Truss's incompetence and inexperience and inappropriateness in being Foreign Secretary. But it also demonstrates something else. It demonstrates the extent of Western ignorance about Russia. Now, as I said, Rostov and Voronezh happen to be big and important cities in Russia, perhaps not first-tier cities, but they are important cities in Russia. It is inconceivable to me that any Western official would not know, any most educated Europeans, or at least Europeans of Liz Truss's level of education, would not know that important French cities or German cities or Italian cities are in France, Germany or Italy. But I am afraid it is all too typical of even educated Westerners, or at least educated British people, to be completely ignorant of Russian geography, to know nothing about Russian cities, to know only of Moscow and St. Petersburg, and to know absolutely nothing else about Russia. And by making this crass comment, Liz Truss again exposed her profound ignorance of Russia. And secondly, what it shows is the criminally poor briefing that Liz Truss received before she came to Moscow. It is inconceivable to me that a properly briefed foreign secretary would not be aware of where these Russian troops that Britain is complaining about are, or would not know the regions and cities of the territories of Russia where those Russian troops are. So the fact that she clearly didn't, the fact that she apparently thought that Voronezh and Rostov were in Donbass, what that shows to me is that the briefing that Liz Truss received from the Foreign Office was either extremely poor, or perhaps more plausibly, that she wasn't interested in a briefing and skipped a proper one. Either way, I suspect that the professional staff of the Foreign Office must be deeply embarrassed by this affair. Now, I ought to say that so far, only the Russian media has disclosed this episode. I've been looking at the British media this morning. I find no references to this event anywhere in the British media. Now, the British obviously are not confirming that this blunder happened, but the fact that they're not denying it either strongly suggests to me that it must indeed have happened. Anyway, so much for that. What actually happened over the course of this meeting, other than the fact that Liz Truss obviously has no real knowledge of Russian geography? Well, we've had a detailed discussion, explanation of everything from Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, over the course of this press conference. And he began with expressions of regret about the fact that there are good humanitarian and cultural exchanges between Britain and Russia. He exaggerates, by the way. Britain and British-Russian humanitarian and cultural exchanges did indeed used to be extremely good until 2014, but they've largely faded out since then. And he also talked about the fact that British-Russian trade is also at reasonably good levels. $24 billion dollars was the level of mutual trade from January as of January to November 2021. By the way, I again consider that to be extremely low, considering the possibilities. But anyway, he talked about the possibilities and the generally good state of humanitarian and cultural and economic relations. But then he talked about the fact that political relations are going absolutely nowhere. And he discussed this at length over the course of his press conference. And he said that he hoped that this meeting would at least provide some possibility for mutual understanding of respective positions between the British and the Russians. But then he went on to say, "We did not get to these matters today. I hope we will be able to discuss a bilateral agenda over a working breakfast. One of the reasons we haven't discussed it yet is because we asked Madam Secretary," he's referring to Liz Truss, "to list the priority topics she wanted to discuss. She listed Ukraine, Belarus, China and Iran. So we spoke at length about the lack of progress on the Minsk agreements, which are not just being sabotaged by Kiev, but are now openly rejected by representatives of the Ukrainian regime. We reported on our steps towards persuading those who have influence on the Kiev regime to convince Vladimir Zelensky and his government to fulfill their obligations under the Minsk agreement as approved by the UN Security Council resolution." Lavrov here is referring to the Americans, the French and the Germans. "We seem to have different interpretations of the Minsk agreements, although I do not see how they can be interpreted differently from what is written there in black and white. That's to say, differences between the British and the Russians about the Minsk agreement. We also spoke about our relations with the Republic of Belarus, including the preparation and holding of the exercises that are starting and causing concern in London and the West. Russian troop deployments on our territory seems to be causing incomprehensible anxiety and very strong reactions from our British colleagues and other Western representatives. Asked by Madam Secretary, I also talked about our relations with China, including the latest talks between President Putin and President Xi Jinping in Beijing. I explained that we are building our relations with China both through bilateral channels as well as within regional and multilateral associations, solely on the basis of mutual respect, a balance of interests and equality, nothing like the leader and follower approach we often see in the North Atlantic Alliance. We are of the same opinion regarding Iran. We believe it is possible to resume the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in full on short notice, but we have a long way to go. In discussing Ukraine, the Foreign Secretary touched on the subject of Russia's initiatives that were introduced in mid-December concerning security guarantees. In Europe, we talked about our approaches to further work on this, primarily with the United States. We expressed our interest in getting more than excuses, but rather specific response to our request for an explanation from our Western colleagues of the interpretation of the commitments they undertook and were approved at the top OSCE level. President Putin talked about our approach in detail, including at the news conference following his talks with President Macron. I hope that during our working breakfast, we will also be able to talk about our interaction of the UN Security Council and Great Britain at the UN Security Council. Russia and Britain are permanent members of this main body. Then he went on to say, we talked about all of this in detail. He then goes on to say that they discussed the issue of Russia's threatened invasion of Ukraine. But then he went on to say, I am disappointed that it was like a conversation between a mute and a deaf. We seem to be listening, but we don't hear each other. In any case, our most detailed explanations fell on unprepared ground. It is like when they say Russia is waiting for the ground to freeze like a stone so its tanks can easily cross into Ukrainian territory. The ground was like that today with our British colleagues. The many facts we've cited fell on it and then just bounced off. We reminded them of President Putin's detailed explanations and of those of other Russian representatives. I felt that our colleagues either have not heard them or are completely ignoring them. You cited the Foreign Secretary as saying that Russia's claims that there are no plans to attack Ukraine are false. Meanwhile, these statements are being made not only by Russia's leaders, but also by the Pentagon. And then he discusses what the Americans are saying, what the Ukrainians themselves are saying about there not being a danger to Ukraine from Russia. And then he went on to say, we explained in the tiniest detail today that Russia's armed forces, when Ms. Foreign Secretary mentioned this as a source of concern in London, are on their own territory, as distinct from the hundreds of thousands of British military troops deployed in the Baltics. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said they should also be sent to Romania and Bulgaria. By the way, here Lavrov is wrong. There are not hundreds of thousands of British military troops in the Baltics. Britain doesn't have hundreds of thousands of troops. Tens of thousands, perhaps, and only a small number of them are in the Baltics. But Britain does not have hundreds of thousands of troops to send anywhere. Anyway, to continue, the response was that if Russia is on its own territory, then NATO is also on its own territory because all of them are NATO members. Today's conversation was permeated with NATO centrism. It was useful for me to understand how indoctrinated our colleagues are when looking at security challenges in Europe, how egoistically they view from their NATO-centric position Russia's lawful concerns about its own security, and how selective they are in interpreting their commitments on the indivisibility of security, which were adopted in the ODYSEE framework. These are pretty ferocious comments about Liz Truss. This is an entire package in one powerful paragraph. The right of each state to choose allies and alliances is recognised, but it is also stated that each country is obliged not to enhance its own security at the expense of the security of others. Respect for a policy of neutrality is emphasised. It is likewise emphasised that a situation where one country, a group of countries, or an organisation dominates the ODYSEE space is unacceptable. The idea of spheres of influence in Europe is also considered unacceptable, but we have cited numerous examples of NATO and the EU establishing such spheres of influence at will. The EU says Russia has nothing to do in the Balkans or in Africa for that matter, whilst the US even appoints an ambassador at large to deal with election law reform in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Isn't this a sphere of influence? Isn't that a US claim to govern all processes in the Balkans? I think this is obvious. We replied to Ms. Truss's questions about our plans with Belarus. All this looks like a unilateral approach based on the unwavering confidence in the West in its right to demand guarantees from us in a situation where nobody promises us guarantees. Unfortunately, this is highly indicative discussion will be repeated. This highly indicative discussion will be repeated in the replies to our questions about the West's interpretations of the principle of indivisibility of security. We are waiting for replies from the OSCE countries. As I understand it, instead of honest answers from every country, the EU wants to compile a collective paper where the nuances of national positions will be blurred. I thought that would happen, by the way. I am convinced that in this case, our conversation will not lead anywhere. We will think about how we can overcome this situation. And then he went on to say, our Western colleagues seem to have learnt the term de-escalation at the same time. Whatever they say about Russia, they also demand de-escalation. Another point is they hope Moscow will choose diplomacy. But we have been choosing diplomacy all these years, and we want to continue to rely on it. The 1999 Istanbul Charter for European Security and the 2010 Astana Declaration are products of diplomacy at its highest level. And then he went on to discuss this, and then he talked about the Minsk agreement. He said, I touched on this topic today. The Foreign Secretary said we needed to look at the sequence of steps in the Minsk agreement. This means only the last clause will be fulfilled, the one where Kiev regains control over the borders, the one that suits the Kiev regime. But this part of the Minsk agreements, approved by the UN Security Council, is conditional on everything else. Only Kiev does not want to do it and has publicly said so. The same strategy as with the indivisibility of security. Agree on something, reassure everyone, then extract a certain part and discard the rest of it as if it was all artificially invented. This approach won't work here. And then he discusses the question of threats. Because he was asked a question about Russia making threats, and he said, we do not want to threaten anyone. Look at our public statements. We have not made a single threat. That's true, by the way. The Russians have never threatened to invade Ukraine. We are the ones who are being threatened. The Foreign Secretary, among others, has recently spoken in the House of Commons. During the talks here, we heard all the same things uttered by the United Kingdom government official representatives before. If we do not stop the alleged aggression, we will face the direst consequences which we will regret. What aggression? When did it start? Against whom? Have you ever heard us say anything like this? I am sure you cannot provide a single example. And then there was asked about whether he was given whether there's any concessions that he'd received from Truss regarding Russia's central concern over NATO enlargement, and he said there's been no change in the demand to withdraw Russian troops from Russian territory in response to our arguments. We have not heard from any other tone. And then at some point he also says that he thinks that the British came to this meeting ill-prepared, which is, I think, fairly clear. And then he discusses briefly the Budapest Declaration about Ukraine's sovereignty, and he says the Foreign Secretary mentioned the Budapest memorandum. I'm sorry she has already done this twice in the hall, despite our detailed explanations that we presented at the talks on this issue. The Budapest memorandum between Russia, Great Britain and the United States provided security guarantees to Ukraine as a non-nuclear state. These were standard guarantees for any non-nuclear state. The memorandum did not oblige Russia, Britain or the United States to recognize the anti-constitutional coup that neo-Nazis and ultra-radicals staged in February 2014. The Budapest Declaration was accompanied by a declaration that was signed by Ukraine and France in addition to this trio, Russia, the US and Britain. The declaration required that all participants, including Ukraine, not allow any violations of the OSCE's fundamental principles, including, this is especially outlined, the principle of respect for rights of ethnic minorities. Ukraine trampled on this. And then Lavrov went on to say, nobody will ever impose on us the demand to recognize unconstitutional regimes in violation of all Russia's international commitments, nor will we ever be compelled to justify the actions of such regimes that discriminate against Russian-speaking people and other ethnic minorities. That, by the way, is the clearest statement I've seen from any Russian official for some time, that Russia does not consider the current Ukrainian government to be legitimate. And of course, this is consistent with the fact that the Russians always refer to the Ukrainian government as the Kiev regime. Anyway, good opportunity for Lavrov to set out his views. He clearly thinks that Liz Truss is, well, perhaps not an idiot exactly, but somebody who has come to Moscow simply spouting talking points from the British media. He was clearly irritated by this, and I have to ask myself the question whether it's going to be any better when Shoigu meets Ben Wallace today. Regardless, there we go. A British Foreign Secretary doesn't know what the territory of Russia is, makes talking points about the Minsk agreement, which are wrong, refuses to engage in negotiations in any respect. Why did she go to Russia at all? Why did the Russians condescend to receive her? Why did Lavrov, an extremely busy man, to put it mildly, waste time with her? I've no idea. The British rationalise this trip by Liz Truss as an attempt to warn the Russians of the consequences if there is an invasion of Ukraine. Well, judging from Lavrov's comments, the Russians weren't in the slightest bit receptive to anything that Liz Truss had to say. I suspect that after this visit of Liz Truss and Ben Wallace, there won't be many more trips by British officials to Moscow for some time. I can't imagine that the Russians are going to waste any more time with the British after this. Well, thank you for joining me today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. Also, please remember to look us up on Locals, as I said at the start of this program, and on Rumble as well. And of course, you can find us on other platforms too. You'll find links under this video. Then you remember also that you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the amazing things that you will find there, like these amazing magic mugs and bomber jackets and all the rest. And also, please don't forget to tick the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon. And thank you again, and have a very good day until then.